Assignment Discovery now presents Last of the Czars, Revolution, Part 1.
In March 1915, the Russian army captured a key fort at Przemysl, Poland. But their joy was short-lived. From now until the summer, they were to suffer defeat after defeat. As desperate as the political situation was, the Tsar and his Empress Alexandra remained absorbed in their own family life and the past glories of the Romanovs. And as the tides of history swelled into a tidal wave, they found themselves right in its course, struggling to remain afloat. Alexandra wrote daily reams to her husband at the front.
In our archives, her letters alone number over 600, and 2/3 of them were written in the years of the First World War. She sometimes wrote 2 or 3 letters a day.
Nikki and Alex wrote to each other in English, their best common language, in a style all of their own, frozen in time.
My own sweet Nikki love, may God help me to repay you 100-fold for all your sweetness. Yes, verily, I doubt there being many such happy wives as I am.
My beloved Sonny, when I read your letters, my eyes are moist. It seems that you are lying on your sofa and that I am listening to you, sitting in my armchair by the lamp. I don't know if I could have endured it all if God had not decreed to give you to me as a wife and friend. I kiss you and the children tenderly. Ever your old hubby, Nikki.
That summer of 1915, Nicky had his hands full at the front. And so his wife began to try to lighten his load by helping with the affairs of state in the capital. That help eventually included conferring with Rasputin over political appointments. One of their joint decisions was to target the head of the army, Nicholas's uncle, the Grand Duke Nicolasha.
Please, my angel, I have absolutely no faith in Nicolasha. I am haunted by our friend's wish, and know it will be fatal for us and for the country if not fulfilled. You know Nicolasha's hatred for Gregory is intense. Nobody knows who is emperor now. It is as though Nicolasha settles all, makes the choices and changes.
At the end of August 1915, Nicholas summoned his council of ministers and told them he was going to replace Nikolai.
My very own beloved one, you have fought this great fight for your country and throne, alone and with bravery and decision. It is the beginning of the great glory of your reign. Our friend said so, and I absolutely believe it. I am near and with you forever and ever, and none shall separate us. Your very own wife, Sonny.
Rasputin was always careful to appear devout and servile with the Empress, leading her to believe that all rumors of debauchery were just that, rumors. Feeling the power of imperial protection, Rasputin now tried to influence government appointments across the board.
People like my grandfather at the time, when he was governor of Petersburg, used to receive little notes, short notes, from Rasputin. All his notes always started in the same way: dear friend, they always say, please appoint so-and-so to whatever Rasputin thought.
Governor Zinoviev threw them into the trash. In fact, it is doubtful that Rasputin's little notes had much impact on ministerial appointments at all.
What is truly important about Rasputin is not what the man did, but what he was perceived to have done or be doing by Russian society. And it's how he was perceived and the way that that destroyed the prestige of the dynasty that is really important in the history of the Russian Revolution.
If Rasputin was damaging the Tsar's name in the capital, the war was testing his subjects' loyalty throughout the rest of the empire. Wounded soldiers, recuperating far from their families, were torn by the letters that started to arrive from home. As a boy, Kolya Isaacek read such letters aloud to soldiers billeted in his school.
They were writing that, for example, Ivan had also been drafted, that one of them had to sell their cow, that the horse couldn't work anymore, that there were no men left in the village. All had been driven away to this carnage, and that we, women, are sowing and gathering in the harvest and doing the work of horses. Life had become very hard. There were no supplies left, no cotton or cloth, barely any kerosene.
The Tsar, the little father, tried to keep morale at the front high. His own morale was far from high as news from Petrograd of strikes and shortages filtered through. And to those who saw their Tsar at this time, his face betrayed his sense of isolation.
When he raised his hand in greeting to us, in his face was, I can't describe it, I saw such a look of terrible despair, as though he were asking us, what shall I do?
That winter of 1916, the whole family were again reunited with Nicholas at headquarters at the front. In December 1916, Rasputin wrote to the Tsar,
I feel that I shall leave life before January the 1st. Tsar of the land of Russia, if you hear the sound of the bell which will tell you that Gregory has been killed, you must know this. If it was your relations who have wrought my death, then no one in your family, that is to say none of your children or relations, will remain alive for more than 2 years. They will be killed by the Russian people. Gregory.
In Petrograd, Rasputin's supposed political influence was grist to the mill of the Tsar's enemies. And in the Duma, one member finally had the courage to say what others were thinking. Vladimir Purishkevich was a prominent monarchist.
The Tsarist ministers are puppets whose strings are held tightly in the hands of Gregory Rasputin, that evil genius of Russia and the Tsar. And the Empress Alexandra, a German woman who's been left on the throne. The Tsar's reluctance to rid himself in Russia of this corrupt man is pushing Russia into an abyss from which there will be no way back.
Those closest to the Tsar felt it was now time to act. The Tsar's first cousin, Grand Duke Dmitri, was to take up the challenge. If Nicholas would not put an end to Rasputin's influence, then he would. The plan was to be masterminded by Prince Felix Yusupov. Married to the Tsar's niece, he was one of the richest men in Russia and known for his flamboyant behavior. A more unlikely assassin would have been hard to find. At the Alexander Palace, the Tsarina was frantic upon hearing the dire rumors about Rasputin. She wrote to Nicky.
You can imagine our feelings, thoughts. Our friend has disappeared. I cannot and won't believe that he has been killed. God have mercy.
3 days later, one of a pair of galoshes belonging to Rasputin was found on the Petrovsky Bridge. The police began to search the river and soon made a grisly discovery. Alexandra was inconsolable. It was her wish that Rasputin be buried in the gardens of the Alexander Palace, where she could take courage from his spiritual presence. Nicholas returned from the front to comfort his grief-stricken wife, who was by now despised by her subjects and bereft of her source of hope. For Nicholas, it was one step closer to the abyss. After a year commanding his battalions in the brutal war with Germany, Nicholas had made little headway against the enemy. The fighting was bleeding the nation dry of men, resources, and morale. Before it was all over, his army would suffer millions of casualties. On the home front, both food and government were bad and in short supply. In the capital, Petrograd, revolution was brewing. From their home, the Alexander Palace outside Petrograd, Alexandra wrote to Nicholas daily, even hourly.
Be Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible. Crush them all under you. Remember, the Tsar rules. How long? Years. People have told me Russia loves to feel the whip. It's their nature. I am fighting for your reign and baby Alexei's future. We must give a strong country to baby and dare not be weak for his sake.
My dear, tender thanks for the severe scolding. I read it with a smile, because you speak to me as though I were a child. Yes, truly, you ought to be my eyes and ears there in the capital, while I have to stay here. At times, when I think of how things will go, it seems my head will burst. Your poor, weak-willed hubby, Nicky.
Nicholas returned home from the front for Christmas and the New Year of 1917. More than ever before, this naturally private family withdrew into their own world. But some of those closest to the family wrote about it, such as Lily Dane, the Empress's confidant.
Every Thursday evening, a small Romanian orchestra played in the Red Drawing Room. The Empress sat by the fire, staring into the glowing embers. She seemed unusually sad. I whispered anxiously, "Oh, Madame, why are you so sad tonight?" The Empress turned and looked at me. "Why am I sad, Lily? I can't say, really. I think my heart is breaking."
Not only her heart, the Romanov Empire itself was about to crumble.
There was talk in the streets, in trams, everywhere. People were saying that all our troubles come from the Tsar's court. The Tsarina is a German, so she's a traitor.
In Petrograd, rumor ruled. Alexandra was a spy. She was giving Nicholas drugs. He was permanently drunk. The truth was that Nicholas was exhausted. And as every decision he made worked out badly, it was better, perhaps, to make no decision at all.
The family began to realize that in some way the Tsar had given up. He had somehow innerly abdicated, probably some 6 months before the real abdication. He didn't believe in himself anymore.
The relatives were desperate. The Tsar's brother-in-law, Grand Duke Alexander, came to plead with Nicholas on behalf of the whole dynasty.
For the first time in history, a revolution is being engineered not from below, but from above. Not by the people against their government, but by the government against the welfare of the people. Nicholas II, Tsar of all the Russias, said simply, "I was born on May the 6th, the day of Job the sufferer. I am ready to accept my doom."
The Tsar's ministers and members of the Duma, or parliament, believed his passivity would destroy them all. The chairman of the Duma was Mikhail Rodzianko.
My grandfather liked so much the emperor that he always had on his desk, I remember it very well, the famous Serov's picture. And he considered him almost as a friend. The only difficulty with him was that he inherited, probably from his mother's side, the kindness, which was also sometimes sort of a impossibility to be forceful.
The man who would eventually emerge as the Russian people's revolutionary hero was still in exile. Lenin greeted the new year of 1917 in Europe, where he addressed a group of Swiss workers.
The hall was practically empty, and Lenin, drawing his conclusions at the end of his speech, said, "There are revolutionary currents in Europe, but I think a socialist revolution is still a long way off. We old boys won't live to see it. You young men will, but we won't." He didn't know that in less than 3 months, in his own country, there would be a revolution.
As Lenin continued to try to build his tiny Bolshevik party in Europe, in Petrograd, the strikes and protests were multiplying daily.
We wrote a declaration to the factory management asking for a rise. If they didn't increase our wages, we would stop work and call a strike, and that's what we did.
The weather made it worse. In February, 1,200 locomotive engines froze and burst. Food and fuel could not be transported. In Petrograd, hunger sharpened the people's anger. At this critical point, Nicholas made a decision to leave his strife-torn capital and return to the headquarters at the front. He arrived on Thursday, the 8th of March. On that very same day, crowds in the capital broke into food shops and helped themselves. By Saturday, even the traditionally loyal Cossacks were assuring the demonstrators that they would not use their guns or whips. Revolution was imminent. Alexandra wrote despairingly to Nicholas on the very eve of the Russian Revolution, Sunday, the 11th of March, the 24th of February by the old Russian calendar.
Yesterday there were rows on the Nevsky Prospect because the poor people stormed the bread shops. They ransacked one shop completely.
The Tsar cabled his response to his frantic ministers.
I command that the disorders in the capital, intolerable during these difficult times of war with Germany, be ended tomorrow.
The order was useless, a fantasy. In the very square where Nicholas had unveiled a statue to his father years before, the revolution, brewing for days now, broke out. Spontaneously, soldiers and citizens became one.
The Russia of labor was marching towards power without suspecting it. The Russia of the ruling class had lost without realizing it.
So wrote Alexander Kerensky, who was to become one of the leaders of the new provisional government.
I saw soldiers surrounded by civilians lining up on the opposite side of the street. They wanted to know what we intended to do with the members of the Tsar's family, and they demanded harsh treatment for them. I said that the most dangerous of them would be kept in custody, but that under no circumstances was the crowd to take the law into its own hands. I insisted that bloodshed be avoided.
With revolutionary troops blocking the railway lines, the Tsar's only option seemed to be to head for the small town of Pskov, where loyal troops were said to remain. On Wednesday, the 14th of March, the imperial train slipped into a siding outside Pskov. Nicholas appealed to his generals for support, in vain. The weakened Nicholas would have to go. It was time to pass on the throne. The most bitter words came from Nicholas's uncle Nikolai, whom the Tsar had removed as head of the army.
As a loyal subject, I consider it my duty to beg you, Your Majesty, on my knees to save Russia and your heir. Cross yourself and pass the throne to your son. There is no other way out.
Grand Duke Nikolai could not quite bring himself to say the word, abdicate. It was said by the courtiers that Nicholas sank into his wife's arms and wept.
Now that you've seen Last of the Tsars, Revolution, Part 1, talk about this. Vladimir Lenin said that he would not see a socialist revolution in Russia during his lifetime. The revolution came 3 months later. Review the factors that inspired the revolution in 1917 and discuss how Lenin was able to build the power base he needed to overthrow the provisional government of Alexander Kerensky. Now try this. Pretend that you are a member of the Duma. Write a paragraph explaining your feelings about the Tsar's relations with Rasputin. Then, hold a class debate about what should be done. Log on to discoveryschool.com for curriculum materials and resources to support Last of the Tsars, Revolution. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests Tsar, The Lost World of Nicholas and Alexandra by Peter Kurth. Consider this before viewing Last of the Tsars, Revolution, Part 2. Create a list of revolutions you're familiar with that took place in different countries over the last century. Are there any common characteristics among them? As you watch the program, look for ways in which the Russian Revolution is similar to or different from other revolutions in history. Be prepared to cite specific points of comparison. Assignment Discovery now presents Last of the Tsars, Revolution, Part 2.
15th of March. For the sake of Russia, I decided to take this step. All around me I see treason, cowardice, and deceit.
Alexandra had no way of knowing that her husband had lost the throne.
My own beloved, precious angel, light of my life. My heart breaks thinking of you all alone, going through all this anguish, anxiety, and we know nothing of you, nor you of us.
To protect his invalid son, Alexei, Nicholas had insisted on abdicating in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Michael.
The soldiers gathered and questioned them about how the Tsar had abdicated his throne. I abdicate in favor of Grand Duke Michael. Why not Alexei? No, he said, my son is ill. I'm not going to give him up. We will go to the Crimea and grow flowers.
When they said the Tsar abdicated, we rejoiced. I remember my father coming in and saying, you can taste some champagne, because the Tsar abdicated. We drank champagne. But it wasn't that we were glad that the Tsar had abdicated. It was a question of another government, which was going to be better.
I remember people came out onto the streets and were kissing each other, hugging each other. They were saying that autocracy is all finished. There will be democratic republic now, freedom, equality.
My grandfather, when he heard that the Tsar abdicated not only for himself, but also for his son, Alexis, he became pale like snow and started having tears and even sobbed and said, well, now Russia is finished. Just like that.
No one saw the once imperial family as a priority. Alexandra did not learn of her husband's abdication until the next day. In the palace, both water and electricity had been cut off. And not only had her adored Nicky been forced to abdicate, but also his brother Michael had rejected the throne. Now there was no Tsar at all. By the time Nicholas returned home, the Alexander Palace was in the hands of the Revolutionary Guards. No one was present when the ex-Tsar met his wife Alexandra. They themselves never wrote about it. It was said by the courtiers that Nicholas sank into his wife's arms and wept. Sometime afterward, Ludmila Krasina and her sisters walked past the palace, which was now patrolled by Revolutionary Guards.
And one of these men, dressed in khaki, he looked like a soldier, was shoveling the snow away from the footpaths. I looked and I thought, this is not a soldier, this is the Tsar himself cleaning the paths of his garden. What is he doing, mademoiselle? I asked. He can't be the Tsar. Yes, she said. You see, he's been deposed. It's the revolution. He's a prisoner in his own palace, and he's not allowed to go out. He is guarded. And he's doing this to get some exercise.
What amazed me, I was a little girl then, was that the Tsar was dressed in an old coat, which was all stained. It wasn't even clean. There were no decorations, nor epaulets. Many years have passed. I'm 90 now, but I still remember it. I still remember the Tsar's expression. There was such pain and suffering. and tears in his eyes.
The family's situation at the Winter Palace was house arrest rather than imprisonment, but it was still a far cry from their previous life. The leaders of the new provisional government were nervous about having the former Tsar so close to the capital. The simplest solution would have been to send the family abroad to one of their European relatives. But they could hardly go to their cousin the Kaiser, with whom Russia was still at war. So the new government requested and received asylum in Great Britain for the Romanovs. But the English king, George V, the cousin of both Nicholas and Alexandra, was unprepared for the public outcry.
Inside England, of course, tempers were running against the Tsar and his German spy wife. All nonsense, of course. She was not a German spy. She was more English than anything else. But that was the situation in England.
George V in 1917 is very worried about the threat to conservatism in general, but to the dynasty in particular, from the socialist movement, from the working class. He doesn't want his dynasty to be associated with the hated Romanovs, let alone the hated and fallen Romanovs.
So King George withdrew the offer of asylum. His cousin, the former Tsar, was now an international pariah.
I'm certainly not ready to criticize King George for withdrawing an invitation to come to the Tsar. Secondly, I'm sure, and a grandmother used to tell me that, the Tsar never wanted to leave Russia. He would have left only if his wife would have asked him to leave.
But there is no record of such a request from Alexandra. For the time being, the family stayed at Tsarskoye Selo. But the world had not stopped. Russia was still at war with Germany, but the Germans had a secret weapon, the banned radical Vladimir Lenin, whom they now sent back to Russia on a sealed train. The Germans knew they could count on a favor from Lenin if he took power.
Lenin had the populist touch. Peace and land for the people, he proclaimed. You soldiers, and there were about 200,000 soldiers in Petrograd. None of you will have to go to the front if you support the Bolsheviks. And they all supported Lenin. Who'd want bloody and dirty trenches when it was much better here in the capital?
Lenin's true hour of glory was still to come. First, he had to tackle Kerensky, who was becoming a leader of the new provisional government. Lenin's propaganda machine went to work on Kerensky, but Lenin's ultimate focus was on the Romanovs, who had been responsible for the hanging of his older brother years before. Lenin wanted them all dead. Even though the deposed Tsar and his family were becoming a liability. The moderate revolutionary Kerensky felt responsible for the Romanovs' safety.
I had the thankless task of telling the former Tsar he would have to move away. The Bolsheviks are after me, I said, and soon they will be after you. Contrary to my expectations, he took the news calmly and expressed his wish to go to the Crimea. Instead, I chose Tobolsk in Siberia, which was without railway communications. I knew that the governor's house was fairly comfortable and could provide decent accommodation for the imperial family.
As the sun rose on August the 14th, the moment came for the once imperial family, with their many trunks and cases, and at least 24 members of the Tsarist household, to leave.
It got quite light. We drank tea, and finally at 5:15, Kerensky said we could go. The sunrise that saw us off was beautiful. We left Tsarskoye Selo at 6:10 in the morning.
The journey into exile was long and slow. 4 days in a train, 2 more on a paddle steamer. On the evening of the 20th of August, they finally reached Tobolsk. Nicholas had once visited the Kremlin here a quarter of a century before. He had stayed in the governor's house, and it was in this very house, renamed Freedom House since the revolution, that the Romanov family were now to be prisoners. By the late fall of 1917, Lenin and his Bolsheviks were poised to seize power. On November 7th, by the Western calendar, the Bolsheviks headed for the Winter Palace, now the stronghold of Kerensky's 7-month-old government. It is one of Soviet history's most legendary moments. The location is genuine enough, but the film's depiction of the famous storming is remembered differently by some.
There was no storming as such. Well, there was a storming, but there was no bloodshed, because all the young cadets, they were just boys, really. They just threw down their arms and surrendered.
Vladimir Antonov Ovsienko was in charge of the famous storming of the Winter Palace.
My father called it a coup, a takeover, and that's why there were practically no casualties. He could have been shot, and his sailors too, but nothing like that happened. The government fell like a ripe pear from the tree.
The provisional government was destroyed, but the damage to the palace consisted of chipped paintwork and a broken window. Kerensky managed to flee Petrograd, never to return. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were now the rulers of Russia. Lenin, whose return to Russia had been engineered by Germany, pushed for peace. In one stroke of the pen, he conceded great tracts of the Russian Empire's western borderlands, nearly 500,000 square miles and more than 1/3 of the population. Peace was popular enough with the demoralized soldiers, who fraternized with German soldiers at the front. But it split the country. In the south, an anti-Bolshevik white army came into being. It was immediately countered by a Bolshevik Red Army. A civil war was brewing, in which the Bolsheviks' main weapon was coercion, the Red Terror. In Tobolsk, Nicholas eventually heard of the disintegration of his Russia. The family had now spent more than 6 months as prisoners in Tobolsk, in the shadow of its ancient Kremlin and cathedral.
I would say that the Romanovs' fate was sealed from the moment that the Bolsheviks came to power. The new regime seized power in what was a coup d'etat. The Bolshevik regime then went on to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany and signed away everything that Russia had gained for 300 years. Having done that, civil war was a certainty. And once you had civil war, Lenin and his party were going to react ruthlessly. I think at that point, there was no hope for the Romanovs. They were bound to die.
On top of everything, Alexei, now nearly 14 years old, was to suffer another serious bout of hemophilia. He would never walk again. In late April 1918, the Bolshevik High Command, now established in the Kremlin in Moscow, issued new orders. The Romanovs were told to get ready to leave, but not where they were going. Across the road from the governor's house lived the Tsar's much-reduced retinue, including Dr. Bortkin, the family physician, and his daughter Tanya. Shortly before Easter, a small gift arrived for Tanya, and with it, a note.
It is dated 1918 and signed O.R. Olga Romanov, Easter 1918. Just a few days before their departure for Ekaterinburg, 3 months before their death.
Christ has risen. My dear Tanya, here are 2 eggs from all of us. It's very sad we can't all be together. With fondest kisses, Olga Romanov.
This fragile family heirloom is the last surviving letter from any of the Grand Duchesses. Under guard, Nicholas and his family were sent on yet another exhausting journey. En route, their train was hijacked by a band of hardened revolutionaries. Their new wardens took them to the town of Ekaterinburg in the Urals. They arrived on April 18, 1918, and were installed in the former house of a merchant named Ipatiev. It was renamed the House of Special Purpose. Nobody knows for sure whether the family realized their fate. There were rumors of escape plans, but it is now known that they were spread deliberately by the Bolsheviks. Lenin, in his Kremlin citadel, faced enemies on all sides. The White Army was threatening Ekaterinburg, and the German Kaiser, Alexandra's cousin, was now expressing concern for the safety of his relatives. Enter Yakov Yurovsky, the Romanovs' new warden. One summer day, he was seen wandering in the forest. He and his cronies located an abandoned mine shaft. They bought drums of gasoline and sulfuric acid. They arranged for a truck. At 1:30 a.m. on July 17th, the family was woken up by Yurovsky and told to prepare to move once again. They were led into a small basement room. There, the 11 prisoners, the family and a small retinue, were suddenly confronted by 11 armed men. There had only been time for incoherent exclamations. Both Yurovsky and one of the guards, Medvedev, recorded in legal depositions their versions of what had happened.
Pavel Medvedev. All the members of the Tsar's family were lying on the floor, very severely wounded. The blood was running in streams.
Yakov Yurovsky. I myself killed Nicholas point blank.
This telegram to the bosses in Moscow announced in a prearranged code that the whole family was dead.
Nicholas has been shot and his family sent to a safe place.
The Tsar's family was not alone. Every Romanov the Bolsheviks could find, they murdered. Nicholas's brother Michael, 9 uncles and cousins, and Alexandra's sister Ella, 18 Romanovs in all. The local Bolsheviks appeared to have carried out the murders on their own initiative, but it now seems clear that it was on orders from Lenin. Lenin took great care, however, to hide the truth, even from his ambassador to Berlin, Adolf Ioffe.
In 1918, when my father was Soviet ambassador in Berlin, he received a communication down the line from Moscow that the former Tsar, Nicholas II, had been shot. He asked, "And what about the family?" He got no reply, and somehow the question was hushed up. And when Dzerzhinsky, head of the secret police, passed through Berlin, father leant on him and said, "Why did you not reply to my queries when everyone was asking me, from the Kaiser down, all Alexander's relatives, you know?" Dzerzhinsky replied, "It was a special order from Lenin. He said, let Yofa be told nothing. It will be easier for him to lie about it there in Berlin."
For over half a century, Lenin and his lies held sway. No one even knew where the remains of the imperial family were buried, until 1979, when years of private and top-secret research pinpointed a certain submerged bridge not far from the original mine.
One morning, at the beginning of May, we came here at 6 o'clock when there was no one around. We removed a few planks and immediately, buried not very deep, we found some human remains.
Identification was to become the key issue. In 1991, the remains were exhumed yet again, officially. But 2 skeletons were missing. So were these bones truly those of the last Tsar and his family? The latest DNA analysis would provide the answer by comparing the Romanov bones with tissue from living relatives. The results proved, with 99% accuracy, that the remains are indeed those of some of the Romanovs. One daughter and the son have not been accounted for, so rumors of Romanov surviving the assassination live on, however unlikely.
Don't go away. Discussion topics, activities, and resources for Last of the Czars, Revolution are coming up next.